Good evening, everyone. I'm Matt Thurlow, the Executive Director of the Decorative Arts Trust. On behalf of our organization, we are thrilled to be partnering with Drayton Hall and all of our friends there for this two-part symposium, exploring race, place, and identity through Lowe country collections. We are delighted to report that more than 240 friends have registered for the program. It's a huge success for us. And we greatly appreciate the support of all of you who chose to make a contribution with your registration, and are grateful for the generosity of 4 lead sponsors: the Jonathan L. Fairbanks Fund of the Decorative Arts Trust, Gilchrist Bizzle Wealth Management of Raymond James, Mrs. Roger P. Hanahan, and Hanson Properties. This evening's program kicks off the festivities with 2 presentations, each delivered by a supremely talented duo. Rather than host separate question and answer sessions following each set of remarks, we will bring all 4 speakers back on screen at the end to respond to your questions. I would like to acknowledge the contributions of my trust colleague, Carrie, who is working off screen tonight, ensuring that everything runs smoothly, allowing this collaborative endeavor to come up without a hitch. Now, without further ado, allow me to introduce our first team of presenters who hail from the National Trust for Historic Preservation and will deliver our keynote address. Elon Cook Lee is a public historian, educator, curator, and interpreter who recently joined the National Trust as Director of Interpretation and Education. Before coming to the National Trust, she served as the Program Director and Curator at the Center of Reconciliation. Carrie Villar is the John and Neville Bryan Senior Director of Museum Collections at the National Trust. In this role, she oversees collections management across the Trust's portfolio of historic sites. And prior to this position, Carrie served as Senior Curator at the History Factory in Washington, D.C. Now, without any disrespect to our other speakers, I would like to acknowledge Elon and Carrie's superlative lecture title, Repairing a Broken History of Pretty Things, which I will inevitably plagiarize at some point in the future. Take it away, Carrie, and thank you all so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you. And while Elon pulls up her screen to share the slides, Elon's going to be running our slides. I will say that the title is all to her credit. She thought it up. So let me know when you can see the slides. There we go. All right. Okay, thank you. Hopefully that's our only technical slowdown tonight. So good evening, everybody. I wish I could be in the same room with all of you and see your faces, but it's a real pleasure to be with you virtually, at least here tonight. Elon and I both want to thank the Drayton Hall Preservation Trust and the Decorative Arts Trust for the invitation to join this fantastic group of curators and scholars who are doing such important work around Low Country collections. And I know while all of us object folks are going through a little withdrawal of being separated from the collections, museums, and places that we love, you know, the pandemic has proved to be a great way to virtually get together and have the opportunity to delve into new scholarship like you'll hear about over the next 2 evenings. When Carter Hudgens from Drayton Hall first shared this opportunity to talk with you, I'll admit that I had a moment where I traveled back in time to grad school at the University of Delaware, where although I had museum studies classes with many Winterthur fellows and always appreciated their depth of study and connoisseurship in the decorative arts, I was part of the other DuPont story as a Hagley Fellow studying the history of industrialization and technology. So I somehow with this group feel that I need to confess this fact. I don't know why before going any further, but I would be equally as excited by the material culture of Drayton Hall's phosphate mining era as I am by its very important decorative arts collection. So with that confession out of the way, Elon, next slide, please. So a little brief background. The National Trust Historic Sites are coast to coast from the Berkshires of Massachusetts to Monterey, California, and represent over 400 years of human history. Drayton Hall is one of these sites, and we're always grateful for our partnership with the Drayton Hall Preservation Trust in operating and preserving and interpreting such an important place. Next slide, Elon. And this just shows the various sites across the country. Next slide. So I work with our sites to oversee the museum collection, which contains over 60,000 objects that are used to illustrate and interpret the stories of these important places and the men, women, and children who lived, worked, or were enslaved there. Our nationally significant collection features fantastic examples of decorative and fine arts, but all combined with the objects of daily life, all grounded and connected to the historic place where they're displayed and interpreted for the public. This power of place, this connection, it gives that powerful extra context to the collections and brings them to life. Next slide, please. So we were chartered by Congress in 1949, and the National Trust was charged with facilitating public participation in the preservation of sites, buildings, and objects of national significance or interest. So, and while in the last 7 decades, our work has certainly expanded, historic sites and objects are still at the core. Next slide, please. So while we assumed responsibility for our first property, Woodlawn in Alexandria, Virginia in 1951, as collections director, and especially with all of you who are interested enough to attend this talk, I have to mention that our first museum object came to us first back in 1949. So our object collection predates our buildings. And this object is a lovely little footstool with needlework done by Nellie Custis Lewis, George Washington's granddaughter and the first resident of Woodlawn. I'll talk about a little bit more about Woodlawn in a bit and how the history of and interpretation of Woodlawn as a historic house has evolved and changed over the years. This change, which happens and is happening at all of our historic sites, is always driven by new scholarship and new understandings of history, but it also reflects changes in American society and American identity and how they're played out in the present moment, whenever that present moment is happening, in how we interpret America's historic places. Next slide, please. So over the past few years, the National Trust has been committed to 2 important initiatives, themes of which can both be seen in the content of this symposium: reimagining historic sites for the 21st century, and a commitment to telling and preserving the full American story. These initiatives really go hand in hand for our sites, and the collections can and are playing an important role in achieving new relevance and inclusion. So a major component in the National Trust commitment was the establishment of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund to draw attention to the remarkable stories that evoke centuries of African American activism and achievement in order to tell the full American story. So over its first 3 years, the Action Fund we're thrilled that they've been able to award close to $5 million to organizations working to preserve places and stories important to Black history. But also with funding from the Action Fund, we've had the opportunity to use our National Trust sites as learning labs to model innovative approaches to interpreting and preserving African American history. For one of the projects, I proposed bringing in African American curators, writers, and artists to our sites, opening the doors to our collection, giving up any authority, and encouraging to explore and create pieces, written, visual, or otherwise, that evolved from their exploration of the collection. That project and what resulted from it has proved to be a fundamental shift for me in how I think about our collections, who they represent, and how we need to work to repair how we collect and interpret objects so we can reflect the true multitude of stories and people at our historic sites. Next slide, please. As I mentioned Woodlawn earlier, one of the sites that we worked on from the collections project was Woodlawn, which was doing an Action Fund project of its own at the same time. Both of the projects interacted with the primarily decorative arts collections there in different ways, and I think illustrate the challenges and opportunities of using traditional decorative arts collections that were typically used to tell stories of privilege and wealth, to tell new, more inclusive stories. As I said, these projects both sparked more questions and answers for me about collections, how we use them, and how we correct some of those inequities that are really built into the fabric of how we've built the collections at our historic sites. And as you can see in the photos here, when Woodlawn came to the Trust in 1951, it was empty after years of different ownership and uses since the Lewis family first lived there starting in 1805. And it ranged from a Quaker free labor colony to artists, to home for authors, to home to a US senator. And the collection had to be reassembled or recreated and it was done in a very traditional historic house model. The bulk of the pieces were what you could consider sort of decorative set pieces, more of the period or as close to the period as they could find, without any real provenance or connection to the site. So with Mount Vernon, which is literally right down the street, because Woodlawn was originally part of the original Mount Vernon land parcel and was given as a gift to the Lewises by the Washingtons. They're right down the street, and the competition for Lewis and Washington family pieces has always been tight. Although we do have, we have a good partnership with Mount Vernon, and we do have some pieces with a clear provenance to the family. The collecting stopped there. It's like the next 150 years didn't exist. We have also almost nothing representing the enslaved, the Quaker era, or other later eras of the property. So telling the full story of the site with the collection as it is now is very difficult. Next slide, please. So for the project at Woodlawn, I invited Monica Montgomery, co-founder of Museum Hue, to curate an exhibit there, potentially using any of the traditional mix of decorative arts and other collections, other items in the collection. But after her first visit, and probably 10 minutes into the visit, we ended up spending lots of time talking about the lack of representation in the collection, the absence of things that spoke to her in regards to the African-American experience. So instead of working with the existing collection, she worked with two artists to create new photography, new representations that placed African-Americans into the narrative of Woodlawn. It was important to her and the artist to make something that placed them in the building and in the story of Woodlawn. Her exploration posed critical questions about the absence of objects at our sites, how the absence of objects can equate to the absence of representation, and how museums and historic sites have to be proactive in finding ways to acknowledge that absence if the actual objects can no longer be acquired. As I said, next slide, please. At the same time, Woodlawn's director was curating an exhibit entitled Makers in the Mansion, where African-American artists and makers were commissioned to create and install pieces that reflected their skills as makers, as well as their identities as African-Americans. So when Woodlawn's director approached me about allowing the artists to incorporate the museum collections into their work, I'm a good collections manager. I was nervous. I initially, hesitated, but I eventually agreed. The main project that ended up impacting the collection involved reupholstering the sofa, as you see here. It was one of those of the period, but not original to the house. And the existing upholstery was from the 1950s from DC department store, Woodward and Lothrop, if you're familiar with it. So there wasn't anything too precious there. Ultimately, I'm so glad that I set those traditional velvet rope collections inclinations aside and decided that representing the African-American experience was more important. Even though the exhibit has since closed, This particular piece still sits in the front entry. It catches visitors' eyes and it gets them interested in learning a new side of the Woodlawn story. It also serves as an important lesson to me to set aside traditional notions of those collections hierarchies, to allow for experimentation, to allow for other views, and that not all objects need to be untouchable. So there is still so much work to do at Woodlawn and across the National Trust to tell the full story, but it's an exciting time. In some ways at Woodlawn, having a decorative arts collection with limited provenance to the house allows us to think creatively about how to reimagine what we collect, how it's interpreted, and how the public can really experience the collection. So while this symposium focuses on the Low Country, and I hope you can forgive me for so much focus on a Virginia site, I am sure that the insights, approaches, and research techniques that the presenters will share can be applicable to decorative arts found in collections across the country. And it's so important that this work can be shared and modeled. And I think Zoom has become a democratizing of sharing of information, which is fantastic, because there's 15,000 historic sites in America. And not all of them have the staff with the skills or the capacity to focus on this type of curatorial research. But it's so critical to changing the conversation about the stories we tell at our sites and how we talk about American material culture. Next slide, please. So before I pass it to my colleague Elon, I want to leave with the two most recent acquisitions to the Woodlawn collection, where we're trying to strategically add items that contribute to telling the stories that we seek to tell at the site. The first item is a scrap of paper. It's simple. It's actually probably just about as small as it's, so you can see it here. This scrap of paper served as the receipt for the sale of 2 enslaved men to Lawrence Lewis, Nellie Custis Lewis's husband. This tiny scrap of paper is all the evidence we have of these 2 men's lives. And the second object is a needlepoint cushion, part of a set created by Martha Washington. And this particular cushion was given to Lorenzo Lewis, Lawrence and Nellie's son, and passed through his family before being donated to Woodlawn. While disparate items, a scrap of paper and a decorative chair cushion, deeper research that I hope we can undertake soon, I think can connect the 2 objects around these ideas that we're talking about here, around race, place, and identity, and the enslaved and free lives that were intertwined at Woodlawn. So I'm looking forward to being inspired by the other speakers in the symposium. And I'd love to hear for your thoughts too tonight during the Q&A, if you have any, about these objects. So with that, I will now turn it over to my colleague, Elon Cook-Lee, the National Trust Director of Interpretation and Education, to take it from here. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. As I'm moving everything around, let me go back to our presentation. There we go. So thank you once again, Carrie, for opening us up in our presentation tonight. So I've been really enjoying getting the conversation started in different conferences and workshops by reminding people of the obvious. It's 2020. And there has been a lot going on this year that is really forcing us to not only deal with what's going on in our lives right now, but also to address the history. And I mean, talk about a year to suddenly be confronted with the wreckage of our nation's past. We've got plantations and wedding organizing platforms that were protested for hosting celebratory events the end of last year and then the beginning of this year. We have historic sites like Decatur House in Washington, D.C. and Drayton Hall in South Carolina that dealt with both the reality and the real threat of property damage and the fears that drew up in the staff. We also had Confederate monuments that were constantly in the news, either for being toppled or protested or tagged or all of the above at the same time. Many of these objects were removed from view, shuttled off somewhere, maybe to be used again, maybe not. But they're also the ones that are still on display in our nation's public spaces that continue to be centers for controversy and protest. And there's also the epidemic that has changed the way that we not only live our lives, but also the way that we work. And the way that we work means that we can either keep ourselves safe or keep our colleagues safe. And how do we do that exactly? We also have had, as you know, museum colleagues, we also have the issue of what's going on, especially with the frontline staff, many of whom were laid off all across the country at all different types of sites, either laid off or losing hours and struggling to figure out how are they going to pay their bills. Are they ever going to get to come back to the places they love and have spent so much of their lives dedicated to? And we've had a local and international effort to reclaim, redistribute, remove objects that have found their ways into our collections through very troubled and often violent histories. And we'll get into all of these different things in just a moment. So one of the things that I really love doing in my work, not only here at the National Trust, but that I've been doing over the last several years in my career. Part of that that you didn't hear about before is that I'm a former adjunct professor at the Rhode Island School of Design, RISD. And I was a 2019-2020 Mellon faculty fellow in the RISD Museum, which is their teaching art museum that's connected to the school. So one of the programs that I did through the museum, and I turned into an entire course through the school, was actually taking time to interview the objects in the museum's collection. And so over the next few slides, I'm going to go through some of the questions that I used and that I encourage you to consider in your work with objects. So the first one really is spending some time doing those object interviews. So pulling an object and asking it some questions, as though pretend you are Barbara Walters. What would you ask of these objects? So an object that some of you might have in your collection is a house. So for the National Trust, we have 28 buildings, including the one you see right here, which is Woodlawn in Virginia. So asking this building, why are you here? How did you get here? Who was here before you and who is here now? These are questions that can help us address the histories that have brought us to where we are in this current moment. So when it comes to the question of Woodlawn, who lived on this site, this landscape, this property before Woodlawn was created? Is that an important part of the storytelling that we need to present to our public so that we can not erase that history? So we can say there were various indigenous groups who lived on this property and what happened to them, and then talk about that history and the erasure and the removal of those people. How did this particular object get here? Who built it? Who designed it? So this is more strategies for us to be thinking through other ways of interpreting these objects, other ways of seeing these objects than maybe we did in the past. When we think about objects from this colonial era and the antebellum era, using these objects as opportunities to explore the history of slavery, to explore race, to explore immigration, to explore the everyday people who have actually really relatable stories, sometimes more relatable than the people at the center of our interpretation, the owners of the homes or the owners of the objects. A next thing in our object interviews is, does this belong here? Does it really? I love this question because it's one of those questions that tends to knock us off our off center as curators. So another fun fact about me is that in my previous job, I spent some time cosplaying as what I like to call feminist Erica Killmonger, and asking curators, Where did this object come from? Why is it here? And does it really need to be here? Should it actually serve a broader purpose in another place? So this question was inspired really by the bronze head of an oba that's in the RISD Museum's collection. So that's the one on your right side. It ended up in the museum's collection and had been for many decades unused and very rarely seen, and was only there after it was violently removed from the Kingdom of Benin in 1897. The people who used and most closely understood objects like this one were massacred, enslaved, colonized, and or exiled to other countries. And in general, they were left utterly powerless to demand its return for centuries. I mean, literally until like last year. But does that mean that it should not be part of the RISD Museum's collection today? So RISD has since started, and I found out like yesterday, actually begun the work of really concluding, wrapping up the process in collaboration with representatives from Benin, which is actually now Nigeria, or this part of Benin is now Nigeria, working with the government and with descendants of the royal family to figure out what to do with this object. And in the meantime, they have put the object on full display for the public and constantly engage the public and people from all around the world, scholars, students, descendants, on how to better interpret, display, and educate the public on this object. And also engage them in conversation about what actually should we do with this? Where does it belong? What's the end for this piece? The other object that is pictured here is a receipt for the sale of two enslaved men, Anthony and Henry. So this is an object that Carrie mentioned earlier in her talk. And so this object reminded me of a piece that's also in the RISD Museum collection. So when I brought a similar piece to the attention of students and the public and asked them, what should we do with this object? People said, oh, we should reinterpret it. We should focus the interpretation on the history of slavery instead of the history of the owners or the person who was selling an enslaved person. And then after several conversations, two of my African-American students stepped forward and said, we should give it back. And who do we give it back to? They said, the descendants. So they actually started doing some work to actually find the descendants of the enslaved man who had been sold in that document in the museum's collection, to see if this is something that can be shared with those descendants. So objects like this receipt here in front of you is an example of the kind of document, the kind of object that in a museum is an interesting object, but to a descendant might be the only thing that represents an entire life for one of their ancestors. The only object that says, my ancestor lived, my ancestor existed. Here's two more objects that are objects that have descendants who have very different lives. And they have very different lives because their ancestors, the people who used these objects or could have used these objects, have had very different lives. So these are two objects that are in the collection from Shadows on the Teche, which is a plantation museum in New Iberia, Louisiana. So in these kinds of objects, there are many ways of looking at them. There's a very decorative arts sort of a viewpoint of what is this object? What is it made of? Let's look at the ways in which it was designed, the ways in which these objects were stitched together. Let's look at the craftsmanship. But what are the other ways that we can look at these objects? Could they be objects that tell us a story about the person who wore it, or the intended end user of this object? So the pants on your left side were actually created for an enslaved child. The dress on the right side was actually created for a slave owning child. These are two children, or they represent two children who would have lived around the same time period and at the same place. How can we use these objects to tell those stories in an interesting and critical way? And how can we connect these objects to the descendants so they can come together in conversation. So another way of thinking about this is how can we juxtapose the objects themselves so that they are actually in conversation? So this was really inspired by the work of Fred Wilson and many other activist curators or curator artists that we've seen in the last several decades. So in Fred Wilson's exhibition based on objects found in the Maryland Historical Society back in the 90s, he was pulling objects that were always interpreted as objects related to slavery with objects that you really had to spend a little more time thinking about, what does this have to do with slavery? What can this tell us about our nation's racial history? And he put them together into conversation. This can be done with any type of object, really trying to have, get the public, bring these objects together, and then you can actually have the public brainstorm as a group. It's done best in small conversation, but brainstorm, what is the meaning? What is the deeper meaning of these objects? What are other ways of interpreting them? What are the stories that these objects can tell us? This is a really useful exercise, not only for curators and for individuals from the public, but so that we can bring these ideas together. A lot of times curators, we can get so focused on seeing these objects in one particular way that we don't get the feedback from the public, who might see these objects in a completely different way, or may have stories that fill in the gaps in our knowledge and our understanding on how to see these objects. And finding descendants. So this has become a huge part of my work at the National Trust with our portfolio of historic sites, 11 of which have histories of slavery, or I guess I found out yesterday, 12 of which have histories of slavery. So what kinds of descendants do our objects have? And so this is an opportunity for us to be thinking about, how can descendants help us fill in these gaps that I was talking about before in our knowledge, our understanding, in our research on these histories. So here I've got two examples of what happens with descendants and objects in our collection. So I'll actually start with the one on the right. So here we have an image of a woman named Tamara Lanier, and she's holding a portrait of her great-great-grandfather, a man named Renty, who was owned by and photographed by a professor at Harvard University. She has actually sued Harvard for the rights and the use of this object. Her argument is, this is an object. This was a image taken of my ancestor without his permission, because as an enslaved person, he had no right to say yes or no. And to actually recapture this object, her demand is this object actually belongs in the hands of the descendants. And that because Harvard has spent decades, or this professor spent many years of his life helping to make his career or to advance his research and the work that he was doing, and now is contributing to the work of Harvard University. But what is it contributing to the descendants of Mr. Renty and his daughter, who's an image of his daughter, who's also part of that collection? So if we are not working appropriately with objects in our collections in the eyes of the descendants, we may end up getting sued, or we may end up getting protested when it comes to some of the buildings enslaved people had been part of building. We may end up in lots of negative interactions. But if we reach out and work with descendants of these objects, people who these objects may have originally belonged to, like in the case of the Benin head, or individuals who had worked with and used these objects in their everyday lives, but maybe hadn't actually paid for them to be made. Working with these descendants have a lot of positive benefits. So on the other hand, we've got the descendants of people who were enslaved to James Madison and other members of the enslaved community in surrounding properties. So James Madison's Montpelier several decades ago actually started reaching out to descendants and asking them to help in the work of interpreting the history of the sites, James Madison and his legacy, the objects and the collection. And this has been a very fortuitous situation that developed out of doing that. So descendants have helped with bringing in grants, bringing in positive attention, and also doing the very incredibly useful and important work of helping to reinterpret the landscape, the buildings, and the objects in the museum's collection. So there are different things that could possibly happen when we work with descendants. But when we get ahead of the situation, when we reach out and we ask questions, and we do it in a loving way, and we do this work through a framework of justice and equity, and say, we see you as experts in the same way that people who have spent their lives doing research. We understand the ways in which these objects impact your lives, and we want you to join us in this work. So this is another way of reinterpreting and helping to see this fuller story of our objects. So I want to leave you all with two more questions. Which one of them is really the title of our presentation? How do we repair a broken history, or how do we repair a broken history of pretty, or in often cases, not so pretty things? And also, how can we use broken histories, broken objects to actually bring ourselves together? And so I'm going to throw things back to Carrie for our final words.
Thanks, Elon. I think you summed it up beautifully just then, but I mean, maybe to begin to answer your question are some of the key takeaways of what Elon and I tried to share tonight, of how you can repair that, what's broken, of acknowledging the absence when finding ways when you just don't have it to acknowledge that. Consider your collection's hierarchies. Not everything needs to be hands-off and velvet roped. Share your scholarship and your methods so that you can, be a voice to the field and to other curators and scholars, just like you all are doing here at this symposium. Interrogate your objects. Even if, as Elon was describing it, I imagine myself doing it and feeling very self-conscious, but it can be, if you can get over that, I think it's a very effective tool. And then of course, engage your descendant communities. That's so very important. So Elon, thank you for presenting with me. Thank you all for listening to us. And our emails are there. We'd love to hear from you either during the Q&A or anytime. Feel free to reach out to us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elon and Carrie, for that excellent presentation, and congratulations on all of the accomplishments that you've brought about with the National Trust. And I think you've kicked off this program at a level that we could only have hoped for originally. And you've introduced so many important topics. And although the interrogation of objects is in a traditional approach for the decorative arts and reaches back into the 60s with Charles Montgomery's 14 points of connoisseurship, but you've elevated that approach in a way that brings in these issues of representation and how objects or the absence of them can lead to important conversations about missing representation and the narratives that we need to bring to visitors at historic sites to recreate those essential stories of the people of the past. And you've just situated this conversation so beautifully. So I'm thank you for that. And as a reminder for those of you who joined later in the program, we'll be hosting a Q&A session with all four presenters when we conclude. And now moving on to our next dynamic duo, colleagues of the Drayton Hall Preservation Trust, our partner for this program and a source of excellent new research on all components of the house, collection, and landscape. Patricia Lowe Smith is the curator of historic architectural resources at Drayton Hall. Trish arrived in 2010 as a Wood Family Fellow and joined the staff permanently upon the completion of her fellowship. Trish assembled Drayton's first preservation archive, carried out several architectural conservation projects, launched a digital restoration of Drayton Hall, and is currently managing the rehabilitation of Drayton Hall's iconic Palladian portico. Amber Satterthwaite, who's going to start things off with us for round 2, arrived in Drayton just last year as Curator of Education and Museum Programs, and has spearheaded Drayton's truly excellent series of online programs that have appeared throughout the past year, including recent events on the preservation, archaeology, and research on those enslaved at the site. And prior to coming to Charleston, Amber served as Director of Education at Tryon Palace. Their presentation is titled Peopling Drayton Hall, Life and Labor at a Palladian Villa. And on to you, Amber.
Thank you. We are so happy to be here tonight to be able to share some really exciting things that are happening at Drayton Hall. In fact, couldn't be a better day for us. Today, we rolled out a brand new audio tour of Drayton Hall for the very first time. And I got an email from my colleague who was working there today, and she said it went very well. And so we're really thrilled to be able to talk with you tonight about how we have gotten to the point that we're able to put some changes into motion as far as our interpretation of the main house. So my colleague Trish and I are here to discuss our research and how we have been able to use that to really lead to this reinterpretation of Drayton Hall, where we see our site going, what our future plans are. So Drayton Hall is well known for being an architectural landmark. The property that would become Drayton Hall was purchased by John Drayton in 1738, and teams of Black and white, free and enslaved craftspeople constructed this home, which today is known as the first fully executed example of Palladian architecture in North America. And you may have heard that before. But what does it mean? What does that tell us about the world in which everyone at Drayton Hall lived? And what about the documentary evidence? We needed to bring all these pieces together to create a more complete story. For decades, the interpretation of Drayton Hall has focused primarily on architecture, and really from a decorative arts point of view, not necessarily on how people used spaces, but on the architectural features, the design elements, and certain members of the Drayton family. But Palladianism, there's a lot more to it than just architectural formality, and there's much more to the story of Drayton Hall than the history of a single family. And by studying the entire house, we see the evidence of enslaved people and how they moved through it, how they worked in the house, how they lived in the house. And the documentary evidence gives us unique human stories that are allowing us to talk with people about Drayton Hall in a whole new way. And for the last few years, Drayton Hall has been working really hard to strengthen social history interpretation by combining the rich architectural history of the main house, which Trish is going to be talking about, with the archaeological and documentary evidence about what daily life was like across the entire site. And the culmination of this multidisciplinary work is our new tour, which highlights the enslaved population at Drayton Hall and how the main house actually demonstrates at every turn their work, their constant presence across the site. Drayton Hall is an African-American history site. It is a place where enslaved people lived and labored and were held in bondage for generations. And as Elon and Carrie have said already, now more than ever, as we are faced with social challenges at every turn in a really dramatic fashion, in which we must face these truths, and we must be able to embrace concepts of social justice and inclusion. Plantation sites cannot be afraid to tackle the difficult history. We have to tell more than the pretty story, and Drayton Hall is eager to do that, and to return people to the main house tour is really our goal. So this evening, Trish and I will share the research that we and our colleagues have completed to create the new tour experience and to put Drayton Hall, we hope, on track to become a resource not only for scholars researching architectural history, but those researching African American history in the Low Country. Trish is going to start us off by sharing some of her incredible research.
All right, well, thank you, Amber. So let's see if I can successfully share a slideshow with you all. Let's see. All right, do you have a PowerPoint on your screen? Yes, Amber's nodding yes, excellent, okay. So while I'm getting myself situated, I would be remiss if I didn't say a special thank you to the Decorative Arts Trust for the opportunity to travel to Veneto with you all in 2017 to study Palladio's villas. A lot of the information that you're going to hear in my portion of the presentation, I learned on that trip. So thank you so much. Those trips are tremendously useful. So as Amber mentioned in her introduction, Drayton Hall is the first fully executed Palladian house in North America. And as Elon discussed earlier tonight, we often think of it as the largest object in our collection. It draws on influences from Northern Italy, England, and the Caribbean, but in the continental US, we know of no other house that so clearly and deliberately embodies Palladian ideologies before Drayton Hall. Now, for decades, this fact was kind of offered up as a point of architectural interest, but now we emphasize the importance of this precocious building through the lens of social history. The design of Drayton Hall represents a deliberate choice that ordered the lives of all the people who lived and worked on the estate, and its role in shaping the architectural taste of our nation from Southern plantations to institutions of learning and lending, all the way up to the leaked draft of this document earlier this year, cannot be overstated. To understand Drayton Hall's architectural significance, it's really useful to begin in Venice, roughly 250 years before John Drayton decided how he'd like to lay out his new estate. And so I hope you will indulge me for a minute on a little history trip to Italy. So in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, forcing Venice to give up their forts and trade monopolies in the Adriatic and Aegean seas, and thus their trade dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean. Their maritime influence was further diminished at the end of the 15th century when Vasco da Gama discovered a sea route to India, shifting trade away from an overland route through North Africa that had relied heavily on Venetian merchants. And finally, the failure of the Venetians' oared galleys to keep up with the advances in maritime technology culminated in a sharp decline of the Italian city-state. So facing a dramatic reversal of their fortunes and really casting about for ways to maintain their wealth and power, Venetian patricians looked inland to the Veneto region of Italy, where they actively worked to create power vacuums and launch land reclamation projects in order to establish themselves as lords of new agricultural estates. As this wealthy merchant class moved into the countryside, they sought to legitimize their presence and maintain their elevated social status by casting themselves as instruments of God's will. And it was during this period of socioeconomic machinations that a young stonecutter turned architect, Andrea Palladio, was studying the architecture of ancient Rome. With their strong emphasis on order and hierarchy, these ancient buildings inspired Palladio's architectural compositions, which helped impose a new social order on the countryside. So in effect, Palladio's villas revived the columns and pediments and architraves favored by the enslavers of antiquity and at the same time breathed new life into these architectural elements as symbols of domination by the ruling class. This is a really important book in which the authors argue that throughout history, when a society with colonial, imperial, and capitalist tendencies has had to legitimate itself through artistic means, it reverts to Palladio's forms to articulate its claim to hegemony by architectural means. And so at Drayton Hall, we continue to emphasize the importance of architecture, but with the intention of bringing attention to what John Drayton hoped to articulate about himself through his built environment. The more overt and typically celebrated messages that we think are conveyed by John Drayton's stylistic choices are those of taste and great material prosperity. The design and furnishing of Drayton Hall clearly communicated this wealth and taste, but we think more importantly, it really demonstrates John Drayton's knowledge of Palladian architecture and what it represents. Daniel Maudlin wrote that in this carefully graded society where the demonstration of taste policed inclusion and exclusion from social groups, a conscious taste for Palladio and Palladianism was found only at the very top. It was the intellectual plaything of the very wealthy, and at that only for those who enjoyed architecture as a pastime. While John Drayton was not alone among his contemporaries in sending such signals through the language of Palladian architecture, he was certainly precocious in the extent to which he embraced the ideology of the Palladian villa. In our new audio tour that Amber mentioned that launched today, you'll hear a shift in the discussion away from an emphasis on what Palladian architecture represents in terms of education and taste in favor of a narrative that explores the unique ability of Palladian forms to demonstrate and maintain the Drayton's power and dominance. Stylistically, Drayton Hall is a Palladian villa, and villas are traditionally beautiful places that exist to create and maintain wealth and power, accomplished by the dominance of some people over others. So really, a villa is a place with a dark social reality, obscured and even legitimized by a mask of beauty and tradition. And what's more, when you study the history of Palladian villas in the Veneto, in the Caribbean, and the American South, you find that these villas are not just particularly large and attractive farmhouses. They embody what James Ackerman calls an intense programmatic investment in ideological goals. On such estates, wealth follows from dominance, and dominance is reinforced at every turn with order, which is achieved through clear social hierarchies communicated by architecture. This is, in part, why we take such care to emphasize that Drayton Hall is a fully executed example of Palladian architecture, because no opportunity was wasted to remind people that they lived in a world where there were those who dominated and those who were dominated. And at Drayton Hall, as elsewhere, such signals extended far beyond the decorative application of classical motifs. Instances of design physically and psychologically reinforcing social hierarchies abound at Drayton Hall. And it's clear that this was not a concept invented by John Drayton. Documentary and architectural evidence indicates that his inspiration came from Palladio, who learned from enslavers of antiquity. At Drayton Hall, this architecture of dominance appears in several forms. First, there's the idea of surveillance. Though physically distant, the main house is situated in such a way that its occupants would have a direct line of sight to the part of the property where we believe slave houses were located. A significant goal identified in our recent strategic planning initiative involves conducting archaeology to locate these slave houses. We can also consider the individual hierarchical elements which are united to create a unified whole. And so at Drayton Hall, as other places, these include the classical orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Additional elements of this composition include means of access. So take a look at this plan of the portico and first floor as I read a quote from Palladio. He wrote, "The architect ought above all to observe that for great men, houses are required with loggias and spacious halls adorned that in such places those may be amused with pleasure who shall wait for the master, or ask him some favor. And for gentlemen of a meaner station, the fabrics ought also to be less, of less expense, and have fewer ornaments. We see this dictum followed very closely with the portico entrances, and further understand that others may have been instructed to enter the cellar, the flanker buildings, or denied access altogether. Here you see an interior cellar door from our architectural fragment collection, which is now on display in a cellar room that we believe housed enslaved people in the main house. The side you can see faces into this small dwelling space. It has flat panels, and its entire surface was left completely bare for a long time, collecting lots of dirt and grease before it was finally whitewashed. The other side of the door that faces the more public space in the cellar features raised panels and had an oil-bound paint applied as soon as it was installed. So with this door, we see that even within the service space of the cellar, there was a hierarchy communicated through details like paneling and paints. Finally, we should consider how people moved through the house and flankers and how these movements were controlled. This is a sketch by Charles Drayton in which he's reworking the spiral staircase that you can see in the house today. He referred to it as the private stair, but it was largely, if not totally, the domain of the enslaved people in the household. In his notes here, you can see him thinking through the levels of access that this staircase might provide. He's drawing doorways and making notes about which rooms should be made accessible by the staircase. And this document illustrates how the building itself was constructed and modified to control the day-to-day interactions between enslavers and enslaved. And our research with other documents further illuminates these interactions, as Amber is now going to discuss.
All right, yeah, give me just a second. I'm going to pull up my presentation here. Build on what Trish was just describing as far as the hierarchy that existed across this site, which is just as evident when we examine the documentary collections as it is when we look at the main house. So I'm going to start out by showing you some documents that we believe were drawn by Charles Drayton, whose drawing of the staircase Trish just described to you. And I'm going to talk about some other Charleses as well. So I'm going to show you some neat documents here. One of the primary questions that we want to answer in the next several years, since we know some enslaved people lived in the main house, is where did the rest of the enslaved community live? Charles Drayton's diaries, which I'm going to talk with you about in a little while, provide few details about that actual community. We really need the physical evidence, the archaeology, to fill in the blanks on that and tell us what daily life looked like there. But we do have a couple of maps that appear to have been drawn by Charles. On this map that we're looking at, the main house is on the left side of the screen in this rectangle. Then over here on the right side, there's an area labeled BG Field 10 acres. We believe that BG stands for burial ground. This is close to where the African American cemetery is located on site. 10 acres seems like a significant amount of space for a cemetery, which has made us kind of think about it. And we have a couple of hypotheses. We wonder if the complex of houses may have been located in this vicinity. And we've also wondered, is it possible that enslaved people who died on other Drayton-owned properties may have been buried at Drayton Hall? But the only way we could really know that is if we found documentary evidence that that was the case. And I think I found something. I think I found something about a week ago that makes me, or at least gives me a clue that it happened on some occasions at least. This is a note that was just jotted down by Charles Drayton III, who was the owner of Drayton Hall in 1850 when he wrote this. He made casual notes for his record keeping in this almanac from 1850. And here in September, he recorded 23, Jane's child died, and 24, Quash carried it to Drayton Hall. In general, Charles Drayton II and the third here wrote far less in their writings about enslaved people. They did not provide very many details. So I was really excited to find this, for not only for the reason that I just mentioned, but also because the name Quash is a name that I'm very familiar with from my research in the writings of Charles Drayton I. Quash is one of the few people who Charles III wrote about with some frequency, but his grandfather, Charles I, wrote a lot about two men named Quash, who appeared to have been father and son, who were both carpenters. And I think we're seeing here perhaps evidence of a multi-generational family, where this family name perhaps has continued on. That's a hypothesis anyway. Now, on the other side of this map, there's another drawing, which appears to be a drawing of the complex of houses that I was just talking about, but there's no orientation, there's no context here to tell us which is, what's north, what's south, where is this actually located on the property. And nevertheless, it's a significant document and appears to show 10 houses here with associated garden plots, poultry ground, pasture, other buildings, including a separate residence for the driver, who was also an enslaved man, whose house perhaps was located between these buildings and the main house. As Trish mentioned, this was all visible from the main house of Drayton Hall. The planned archaeology that Trish talked about is going to reveal a lot of valuable details for us about what these houses looked like, and more importantly, about the people who lived in them, because now we really can only rely on the writings of their enslavers. I want to introduce you on that note to a project I began in spring of 2019, really a deep dive into the writings of Charles Drayton I, that I will simply refer to as the Diaries Project. It was meant to enhance our knowledge of enslaved people at Drayton Hall. Charles was the second long-term owner of Drayton Hall, and he kept detailed diaries during his years of ownership. He moved in 1784. He died in 1820, and during that time, Drayton Hall was his primary residence, and he owned several other plantations. And when I began working at Drayton Hall in spring of 2019, we were discussing the urgent need to update the house tour to include more social history. And I thought Charles's diaries would be the best resource to turn to, specifically to learn more about the enslaved population. As far as the documentary evidence is concerned, it really is an incredible resource, even if it is from the eyes of a single person who happened to be a large-scale enslaver. I was hoping we'd be able to trace family lines over time. That didn't turn out exactly the way I'd hoped it would. Nevertheless, I think we came up with a wealth of information and many interpretive discoveries, which we're now able to tell every day in the new audio tour. Charles mentioned over 190 enslaved people by name in his diaries, which is really remarkable. Not all of them lived at Drayton Hall, but the diaries reveal that families were spread across Charles's plantations, and people, either individually or in family or work groups, were continually being moved from one property to another, either to live or to work for a short time or an extended period of time. So we see some universal themes of slavery being reflected through Charles Drayton's writings. Themes of families being separated via forced migration, people being sold to other individuals and away from families. He did record those types of things. excuse me, in many instances, multiple individuals had the same first name. Charles only referred to enslaved people by their first names in his diaries. So he often used occupational names or other characteristics to differentiate between people. And by doing this, by not giving them a full identity, by not giving them a last name, he has created hierarchy, social distance, even in these documents. In these diary entries, Charles moved casually from one topic to another. It is not easy to find information about individuals because there's so many remarks, so many observations that may be included in a single entry. And this is one reason why it can be cumbersome or difficult when you're trying to research a specific individual in these diaries, as probably comes as no surprise. So I thought it would be beneficial if we could have a single resource with all the entries about each enslaved person consolidated. So with the assistance of one of my colleagues, I read through the diaries and we pulled out every entry that referenced enslaved people and organized them for easy reference. The diary entries provide information about people inside and outside the main house at Drayton Hall and on other plantations, what kinds of work they performed, what tools they used, what food they ate, what kind of clothes they wore, their relationships with one another, even personal belongings, Charles sometimes mentioned. The result of the project is a collection of all the names of and entries about enslaved people that who were mentioned in Charles's diaries. The information was assembled for Drayton Hall staff in a binder where every enslaved person is listed in alphabetical order. And then there's information, kind of biographical information about the individual at the top. As you can see here, we're looking at Carolina bricklayer. We can see he had a son named Peter. He was the foreman of a gang of bricklayers and some other unique information there to give you an idea of what this resource looks like. Every diary entry in which Carolina appeared then follows here in chronological order. So it's much easier to read every entry about him. It's almost like reading a mini biography of individuals from Charles's point of view. But that's really what my vision was for that project. Now, Trish also has a remarkable vision as far as what she can create to help us interpret spaces of Drayton Hall. And I'm going to hand it back over to her so she can show you some remarkable work.
Right. All right, hopefully that's showing up okay for you all.
Yes.
So one of the challenges that we've always faced with interpreting Drayton Hall is helping our visitors imagine the empty rooms full of life. And, you know, how do we get stories like the ones that Amber's been teasing out with her diary project to our visitors in as many different ways as possible? In 2014, we produced our first 3D visualizations like this one that you're looking at to show what Drayton Hall looked like in the 18th century with restored interiors and objects that belonged to the Drayton family. And these little vignettes help us people the house. And so with these new insights from Amber's Diaries project, we will create new 3D images to complement her biographical sketches of enslaved people. People like Quash, a carpenter who built a table for the servants' hall, or Dumplin and Affy, whose different roles likely led to different experiences of the same house. This is where another one of our digital offerings is useful. So I'm going to launch what we've started calling our dollhouse, while Amber discusses two of the spaces that we find really evocative of Dumplin and Affy's lives. All right, so here's the dollhouse. That look okay, Amber?
All right, great.
Okay.
Now, in general, Charles wrote in his diaries a lot more about men than women overall. But there were a couple of women who lived and worked in the main house who he shared some notable details about. And they're both talked about in the new audio tour. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity here for us to see this really cool 3D image of the house and consider the different experiences, the different ways that they lived and worked in here. Dumplin was a cook who Charles Drayton mentioned. Dumplin lived here in the cellar, and she worked probably as kind of a supervisor in the kitchen to a number of lower cooks and scullery maids and other people who were working in the kitchen. Here we are in the kitchen. You can see that big hearth on the right side of the screen. This was all Dumplin's workspace. And like Trish was just mentioning with the vignettes, here's a wonderful opportunity for us to put in maybe some big tables like the one Quash made, some a swing arm that we know was in that fireplace, to kind of bring that back to life as we tell the story of Dumplin. It has a really fascinating story, and whose story actually gives us the only glimpse into funerary customs of enslaved people at Drayton Hall. Charles does give us a little snippet in his diaries that Dumplin engaged in sitting up all night with the body of a recently deceased person. And while that's really all he said, that's something that's very valuable for us to know and to be able to consider as we think about the ways in which these enslaved individuals interacted with other across this large community that was Drayton Hall. Now, if you want to head on upstairs, we'll take a look at a very different space. Here we are on the second floor of the house. This is a space that where there are several chambers that probably functioned as bed chambers, living spaces for the Drayton family. But they didn't live there by themselves. There was there were a number of enslaved individuals who likely spent time in these spaces, and Affy was definitely one of them. Affy was the woman who cared for the Drayton children. And perhaps she slept maybe on a pallet in one of these rooms, or maybe in a hallway between some of the rooms. But certainly this is an area of the house that she would be incredibly familiar with. So here are two women living under the same roof with their enslavers, having incredibly different experience in how they utilized this house, which areas of the home they had access to, and think about what kind of information they had access to. Affy living very close with the Drayton family. She was someone who Charles wrote about a lot. In fact, he mentioned her 12 times over a span of 35 years, which is more than any other woman in the diaries.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it fully over to you, Amber.
Oh, okay. So I think you can get a sense here that technology really enhances our ability to people Drayton Hall. And earlier this year, we did pursue grant funding that would have enabled us to engage with exhibit designers to integrate some of these visuals throughout our tours in thoughtful and impactful ways. While our project wasn't selected for funding this year, we remain committed to advancing this project and finding innovative ways to interpret social history and tell personal stories in an unfurnished space. Another challenge that we have is helping people to see Drayton Hall as an African-American history site. We know it is, but we have to continually reinforce that to help people see it as more than an architectural landmark. We hope to accomplish this through the new audio tour. We have an updated self-guided walking map that will soon be available to guests virtually and on site. And through our continued research in the African American community, in accordance with our 10-year strategic plan, as Trish mentioned earlier, all of this will allow us to continue to people Drayton Hall and add to our knowledge of the diverse communities that live there over time. And we really look forward to sharing more with you as we learn more.
Well, beautifully done, Trish and Amber. And among the many things that we admire about Drayton Hall is the way that you're so dutifully and carefully and experientially blending the intersection of technology with more traditional documentary-based research, the way that Amber and Trish are pairing their respective specialties to not only delve into these very rich diaries produced by Charles Drayton, but with Trish's incredible analysis of the built environment and the incredibly rich stories and narratives that you're bringing to bear through that collaboration. It's just incredibly important, and we're grateful for your willingness to share it with our audience today. So at this point, we're going to bring back Elon and Carrie for the Q&A portion of the evening. And if anyone in the audience would like to pose a question to the group, please feel free to enter those into the Q&A or the chat, and I'll be monitoring both streams to the best of my ability. To get things started, both pairs of presenters this evening have really emphasized the present nature of their research in terms of Elon's reference to 2020 and the social justice movement and how that's playing out at national trust sites and around the country, the cutting edge nature of the work that Amber and Trish are tackling at this point. If I could get the ball rolling here, Elon, I'd love to hear first and foremost about this discovery of the 12th site and the National Trust portfolio that's been connected to the story of slavery, but also thinking about the breadth of the National Trust portfolio in a site like the Woodrow Wilson House in Washington, D.C. And in this era of reconciliation, Wilson is a name that an individual that has, I think, been given an important second glance. And when we think about Princeton University's decision to disassociate his name from their public policy school and how that type of conversation could be playing out at a National Trust site that on the surface perhaps doesn't have connectivity to slavery, but certainly has one to racism. So if you wouldn't mind jumping in on, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. So I started at the National Trust last November, and when I applied to the job, one of the things that I found most interesting was, being that I'm someone who came from a background that was focused specifically on the history of slavery and on exploring the legacy when it comes to conversations about race in America today. So I was actually really excited to see that the National Trust had such a fascinating portfolio of 27 sites that are open to the public, 10 of which are part of a working group that we have now called the Sites of Enslavement Working Group. And so that includes 7 plantations, 2 urban estates, and a house of worship, all that have strong connections to the history of slavery. And so after getting that working group started, about a month or so ago, I heard that one of our other sites, a site in California, also had a history of slavery, but it was connected to the enslavement of indigenous people. And then yesterday, or was that today, Carrie? Maybe that was today, I actually found out that we have a site in Texas that the owner of the house was directly involved in the owning of enslaved people. So even though the house was built after the end of slavery, technically in 1865, it was built after that point. The homeowner had been a enslaver and had built some of that wealth from, or at least sustained wealth from the history of slavery. So that was a fascinating revelation. It's one of those things that happens when we look at the broader histories of historic sites. When it comes to the Woodrow Wilson House, I think we really have a fascinating case study with that site, as they have sought to reinterpret the history of the building, its collections, and Woodrow Wilson in general. We had a really wonderful conversation with the director of that site, Elizabeth Karcher, earlier today, where she was talking about some of the new initiatives they've been doing to rethink how they can talk to the public about that site. Because Woodrow Wilson, like you mentioned, was definitely involved in racially excluding people from his administration, and his administration led the work of removing African-American federal workers from federal service. So there had actually been Black people working for the federal government in some cases relatively prominent positions, and his administration came through and said, nope, that's the end of that. So bringing attention to that history and doing some repair work on that. So working directly with Black communities to rethink Wilson's legacy. And also to think about, the ways in which his policies, both domestic and international, impacted not only people of color in this country, but people of color all around the world. So it's been really fascinating to explore that. And all of these sites really are great opportunities for engaging in conversations about race in America's past, which can help us get through some of the really challenging conversations we need to have about race in America's present.
Thank you. For the Drayton team, question from Trish McCrae. Where were the other Drayton plantations located? What was their purpose? And were any indentured servants at the Drayton properties other than African American?
There's no record of indentured servants. Now, as far as the other plantation properties, it really depends on which generation we're looking at, because John Drayton, first generation, who had Drayton Hall constructed, owned over 76,000 acres of property, over 120 working plantations across South Carolina. I think the majority of them were here kind of in not necessarily in the Low Country, but at least on the eastern side of the colony. But in Charles Drayton's period, which is the primary time period of my research, I think Charles mentioned 6 plantations in his diaries, I am pretty sure. And most of them were close. Some of them were extremely close. I live actually in an area that used to be one of these plantations, and it only takes me about 10 minutes to drive to Drayton Hall. So they were relatively near one another.
Thank you. Another question about Drayton, and perhaps this is from a participant who hasn't visited since you all opened your new museum facility, but why no objects at Drayton, and will objects ever be added in the house itself, perhaps, to tell the stories?
So I'm happy to take this one on. While there are no objects in Drayton Hall, there are certainly lots of objects at Drayton Hall, at the site. So we do have a gallery space where you can see some of our objects on display. The reason you don't see any in the main house is that it is not climate controlled. It never has been. There's no HVAC, there's no heat, no air conditioning, very little electricity. So it's not really an appropriate place for us to display objects, but you certainly can see them on the property.
For Carrie, you mentioned some incredible statistics at the beginning of your presentation, 60,000 objects, 28 sites tasked with illustrating 400 years of history. Given the fact that you oversee the breadth of that ilk, what exciting projects are in store for the National Trust, or how do you really direct your energy and attention to the next endeavor?
That's a good question, and made ever so more difficult in this crazy year of pandemic that we've been going through. I am really most energized by the way we're coming together and really taking deep dive looks at some of our sites, the Wilson House being one of them, some of our plantation sites, to really put aside that someday we'll get to it. Someday we'll do the work that we need to do to really tell these stories. But we're putting the focus on it in a concentrated way right now, and holding ourselves accountable to results, to improve our interpretation, to improve our collections, to really become models for how historic sites should and could be doing this work.
For the folks at Drayton, there's a question focused on your use of the term team, looking at the work of freed and enslaved people that developed the house, and is that an appropriate phrase to use in conjunction or in juxtaposition against the brutality of slavery? Asking the question, as history proves, language like architecture is a powerful tool of hierarchy, social order, and white supremacy. Are you willing to offer a response to that question?
Sure, I think that's an excellent point. And the truth of the matter is, when it all comes down, we don't really know exactly how the labor was divided for the construction of the main house, or who was responsible for certain aspects of the house. But I think that's an excellent point. It's a great reminder for us that, to assume that there was a level of equality within the use of the word teams there was definitely not intended, because certainly that was not the case. Trish, would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that that's a very fair point and a helpful comment that I appreciate hearing. And I think I'll just kind of echo what you said, Amber, that I think that's a term that we use that reflects how little we understand about who actually built Drayton Hall. It's kind of, that's us casting about for how to refer to people when we don't really even know who we're talking about. Are we talking about white craftspeople? Are we talking about enslaved craftspeople? We just don't know. But that's a helpful thing to point out, and so we'll think more carefully about how we speak about that in the future.
For Carrie and Elon at the National Trust, could you describe a bit about the collaboration that you have with the specific site directors and curators, and how you envision sites taking action in terms of the positioning of objects or the refurnishing or redisplay of collections at sites within the National Trust family?
Elon, you want me to take a stab at this one? So without going into the granular detail of how the trust is structured, which nobody is interested in except people at the trust, Elon and I both serve as a team from National Trust headquarters that are provide technical services to the historic sites in our portfolio. So Elon's specialty is interpretation and education. I provide technical support for collections, and then we also have planning, development, and architecture. So with we provide the sort of in-house consulting to support our sites as they go through reinterpretation or redoing a furnishing plan, for example. You know, I think if this, I saw one question in the Q&A about, you know, how much leeway would we give folks to, you know, reinstall and move objects around. And I think at some sites like Woodlawn, which has very little authenticity to begin with, the sky's the limit, you know, whether it's that maker's installation or, you know, looking at how we can, in one space, talk about the Quaker era as well as the Lewis era. You know, I think we need to have the freedom to tell our stories. That's the important thing, rather than the strict authenticity of how a room is furnished.
And following up on that topic, we have a question, and perhaps these objects aren't found in any National Trust house collections, but thinking of Blackamoor figures that were so popular during the Enlightenment era in the 18th century, how should historic houses consider these objects? Should they be called out or interpreted in a particular way because of their, you know, blatant illustration of racism in that era? I mean, how do these objects, I think, function in a contemporary house museum setting?
So I can take that one. So this is one of the more fascinating things that I really love digging into when it comes to working with collections. So nearly all collections have at least one, often many, kind of iffy objects that if you just put them on display, you can cause a lot of problems. You cause a lot of offense, upset, people get into arguments about it. And so it's really thinking conscientiously about how to interpret that object. In my work with the RISD Museum, we had a pretty decent sized collection of what we might think of as offensive objects, like Blackamoor brooches, mammy figurines. There's a variety of interesting stuff in there. Also, objects that are offending a variety of different racial, ethnic, and religious groups, nationalities, here and abroad. So the question I often got in that was, shouldn't we just kind of keep them in the collection, close them off, hide them away? And no, if we think about it, a lot of our family members have very similar objects sitting in their homes right now, on the mantelpiece, maybe on the table, in the living room. And they are pieces that, you know, maybe they purchased or an older family member purchased at some point in relatively recent history. So when we hide that thing away, we're actually hiding and avoiding some really important conversations. So at the RISD Museum, we brought those objects out and we put them on display as part of discussion programs. And so we did a lot of research on the background of those objects. So with the Blackamoors, as an example, there were a few of those in the collection. And so we looked at what kinds of artists were creating these pieces. What were the racial ideologies that were popular in the country in which this piece was made? Who was the person who originally purchased this object? What was going on in their lives, in their worlds, their personal perspectives on the world and on others? And then also thought about, okay, what are the racial ideologies that are very popular right now, that are the ways that are the framework through which we are seeing these objects as people living in 2020. And then we use all of that information to reinterpret the objects. So if you're not comfortable working with the public, directly having those kinds of conversations, then it can also be bringing in historians, scholars who are specific on this topic to help you reinterpret it. But this is not the kind of thing I would hide. This is the kind of thing that helps us better understand not only the history of our country, in some cases, the history of our world, but who we are as Americans right now, and our families and our friends, and who we are. So I say bring it out and talk about it.
Yeah, and I'll agree. I think one of the things that we talk about this a lot at the Trust is our current society obviously has issues with civil discourse, and historic sites and museums can be a place where those objects can be used to spark those conversations and talk about important topics in a structured and meaningful way. And so I think by packing them away, you're doing a disservice to the potential of those conversations.
And as a last thought on that, if you all have a chance to ever check out the Jim Crow Museum at Ferris State University, the director and the founder of the collection pulled together a variety of what we might think of as racist objects in this really massive collection. And they do educational programs on that. And they've also published 2 books on how to interpret these types of objects. So that's just another resource if you have these kinds of pieces in your collection.
And I think you all have raised such an important underlying thought or thread that's linked to these presentations, is that there's such a great deal of willingness for people to reach out and share insight and guidance on so many of these challenging topics. And I hope that those that are involved with institutions that are struggling or looking for mentorship or leadership, have the opportunity now to think about colleagues that they could connect to and build upon the work that you all have been doing at the National Trust, or Trish and Amber are tackling at Drayton Hall. One thread that's come up through the chat and Q&A at Drayton is the reference to the name Quash, and Carrie kindly tackled this one in terms of explaining the derivation, but as I suspect Tiffany Moman will mention in her presentation tomorrow, Quash Williams is a very talented carpenter in 18th century Charleston tied to the Pinckney Mansion. Trish and Amber, is it thought that same Quash could be tied to Drayton? Is it a member of the same family, or just an instance of the commonality of that particular name?
We were actually just talking about this yesterday.
Yes.
There doesn't seem to be any connection between him and Drayton Hall, but certainly an interesting figure. And it certainly, like you said, kind of a common name in this in general here.
We were just talking about that article and how we were drawn to it because there's this great exploration of Quash, the carpenter, at the Pinckney Mansion. And one of our frustrations at Drayton Hall is that we have very few records about this first period of Drayton Hall. So, similar time that John Quash Williams was working. So we're kind of intrigued by this, but at this point, we really have no way of knowing from our end what connection there may be, if any.
And we had one participant mention that she's just recently learned that she's the descendant of a member of the enslaved community at Drayton, which I think puts an incredible punctuation mark on this program. But I guess either for our colleagues from Drayton Hall or the National Trust in your work to reach out to ancestor communities, could you talk about the processes by which you make those connections and the conversations that you pursue once they've been made?
So I can speak about it from the perspective of the work of the Sites of Enslavement Working Group. So this is where one of our sort of sub initiatives is working with each of the sites in our portfolio or each of our sites of enslavement in our portfolio to begin thinking about how they can get in contact with descendants of the enslaved people at their site. Some of our sites have actually already started doing that. Montpelier, like I mentioned before, started that about, I think, 20 or 30 years ago. And in a previous iteration, and they actually have a organized descendants committee with a member who is on the board of Montpelier. So it's a really, really fascinating way to incorporate descendants into the overall work of the historic site. And like I said, the descendants help to bring in major donors and grants. And so it's a great opportunity for a historic site to work with the descendants in a lot of ways. So we at headquarters don't work directly with descendants. When we hear about folks, we send them to the sites. And so then the sites often have either a staff person who's directly doing that work, like Montpelier did, or there are other colleagues who are working together to figure out how can we connect these folks with our work, our current and future work. And with any luck, you will be hearing more about that in the coming year.
So I can add to that for what we're doing specifically at Drayton Hall. We do have a relationship with the Bowens family, who are descended from enslaved people at Drayton Hall. We have actually on my architectural resources committee, we have a board member who is a descendant and also informs the work that I do specifically at Drayton Hall. And Amber and our colleague Cameron Moon has been doing a lot of research recently that has been helping us understand the kind of postbellum early 20th century history of the site. And so she, in doing that work, is uncovering a lot of really helpful genealogical information. And, you know, something that we're feeling really strongly about right now with this research is that the onus is on us to make it so much more accessible to people, because we find, you know, from time to time, people will approach us and say, you know, I think I might be a descendant. I think I have this connection. What information do you have? But we recognize that, you know, that we should be able to skip that step, you know, that it should be much easier for people to understand what we can offer in that regard. So we're working on it.
I think one final question that pulls together a few inquiries tied to Drayton was mentioned at the outset of your presentation, the displaced indigenous peoples that would have been living in the Low Country. By the 18th century, when Drayton Hall was developed, were there fragments of those communities still extant, and were they involved at Drayton Hall as well, on any level, either in the house's construction, as labor on the plantation? Any information on the Native American presence on the site?
Now, one of our colleagues has been undertaking a massive amount of archaeological research and kind of cataloging artifacts. She's been working with some colleagues at other institutions to learn more about certain types of ceramics at Drayton Hall. But having said all that, it's unclear the role that Native Americans played at Drayton Hall in the 18th century. And it's it kind of like Trish mentioned, and I wish we had mentioned this in our presentation, just didn't think about it. We do not have many records from the earlier part of Drayton Hall's history where we would be able to fill in some of those blanks. So the archaeology is a little it's really not clear, and we're really not able to say to what extent, to what role they may have played during those formative years.
I will say I was thinking about this topic as Elon was discussing interrogating objects, and especially what was here before this. And so one of the really fascinating things about Drayton Hall is that it is definitely not the first dwelling on the site, and not even on the exact location that it's in on the site. So we know that there was an earlier European brick dwelling on the exact same spot that Drayton Hall is on. And before that, we've seen in a recent excavation in the cellar that there was a Native American occupation on that exact spot on the site. And so I would be out of my depth if I tried to talk about that Native American occupation, but I can say that it was there. And I'll stop.
If I can say one more thing on that. So one of the things that I learned in my work at the RISD Museum is that a lot of times we get really focused on seeing objects in a particular way, or coming from our particular lived experience or scholarly research. And so it can be really helpful to bring people in who are, descendants, whether it's descendants of slavery or descendants of indigenous groups from the area, and actually just sort of open up the collection and help us identify objects for reinterpretation. So it's not just saying, hey, we've got this arrowhead, local indigenous community, can you help us interpret this arrowhead? Okay, that's an obvious one. Is there something in our collection that maybe we never would have known you would have been connected to? And so just letting someone actually go through some of the objects in the collection and point out and reinterpret that object in ways that, from our particular silo, we may not be able to see the object in that particular way.
Well, on that note of recreating narrative and investigating objects along lines that they haven't previously been analyzed, I think we'll bring the program to a close this evening. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you to Elon, Carrie, Trish, and Amber for your incredible contributions. The Decorative Arts Trust team would also like to send happiest birthday wishes to Carter Hudgens, President and CEO of Drayton Hall, who looks forward to seeing you all back on Zoom tomorrow evening at 5 p.m. for part 2. So good night, stay well. Thank you to our speakers. It really exceeded, I think, all of our expectations. Some excellent questions from our attendees, and delighted to have this opportunity not only to present this live, but know that it'll continue to be a very valuable resource moving forward. So thank you all. Be healthy, be well, and look forward to seeing you next time. Good night.